Welcome to this episode of Erasing Shame, where we are encouraging Christian Asian mental health. My name is DJ Chuang. I'm joined with my son, Jeremiah. And DJ stands for Dad of Jeremiah, thanks to my son's creative acronym decoding. And this episode will be a father and son conversation about depression and suicide. Now, we were both Chinese American. I was born in Taiwan and came to the US. I was 8 years old. My dad is from Fujian. So technically, my lineage is Fujianese. Over the years, I'm now 56 years old. Over the years, I've had quite a bit of life experience, and we're going to touch on parts of that. Starting with a content and trigger warning, we're going to be talking about depression and suicidal ideation, because these are very important topics. They're a matter of life and death, and they touched myself and my son Jeremiah in very personal ways. So in terms of depression, I have often felt sadness throughout my life. I think I first noticed it in middle school and high school. And then it's persisted all the way through my 20s and even into my 30s, 40s, and 50s. So when it came to my feelings and my emotions, growing up in a traditional Chinese home, my default emotion was just sadness. And Jeremiah, you've seen some of my childhood pictures from high school where I just have a sad face. I just didn't feel happy, and therefore I had the conviction that I wanted to be honest with my feelings, and I didn't want to pretend having a happy face when I felt sad. Mm-hmm. Even though I had good grades, I graduated 7th in my class of high school with 149, which is a small high school, but just to say that school I was doing well. And because I was doing well in school, there wasn't the urgency or the concern that my family had to get me counseling or get me help. Plus, we had the stigma and shame of not seeing a counselor because we're Chinese, we're Asian, we don't.
Mm-hmm. Counselors are for crazy people.
Yes.
And we're obviously not crazy.
We were not crazy in the sense of unable to manage the things of life. And so that was most of my life into my 20s and even into my 30s. I went to college at Virginia Tech. I graduated with a computer engineering degree. I worked a couple years, then I went to seminary in Dallas, worked for another 5 years. My son was born in 1997 when I was 31 years old. And then I was diagnosed bipolar at the age of 35 when I had a difficult transition from leaving being a pastor to going back and being a software developer and engineer. And over the past 20 years, I've worked in the nonprofit world and now doing some podcasting as a passion project and as an outflow of my life as I've learned to better manage my mental health. And in 2017, I had another episode that was very dramatic and difficult to recover from regarding my mental health. So I want to bring my son Jeremiah into the conversation. So in the past 25 years of your life and living with someone who has a mental health diagnosis, how has that affected you and what have you observed?
What I remember in my childhood growing up was spending a lot of time reading books or watching TV, doing sorts of activities you can do alone. I'm an only child, so I didn't have any siblings nearby, any peers to just play with or make faces with or just be a kid with. But something I did not learn very much about was emotions and emotional health. So that was absent from my years growing up because of cultural reasons, as well as just ignorance.
Now, did it affect you? Did you notice that I had emotional outbursts of anger or being withdrawn or being disengaged? What could you interpret now in hindsight besides not being able to put words to it?
I can't remember anything specific from you.
So we got along pretty good?
Yes.
Okay.
Most of what I remember with you growing up was we did a lot of piggyback rides. So we have some pictures. I enjoyed doing piggyback rides. And we would go swimming as a family in the water. And we would have family dinner every night.
Oh, and we still do most of the time.
We still do that very often, even as I'm an adult. And
good.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to give people a peek into what our family life was like, even though we didn't have the emotional vocabulary to process some of the more challenging feelings that just come up in life with things. Now, I'm married to Jeremiah's mom, who's very emotional as an artist. And the way those emotions got expressed was through bold colors in art, not necessarily with words all the time.
Yeah.
How was that helpful, and how was that different for you, Jeremiah?
With mom, it's easier to read her emotions based off of her body language and her facial expressions. So it was nice to be on her good side and to see her being happy and enthusiastic. But with that ease of expression, there was also some fear I had if I was doing something wrong, if she was angry about something or stressed out from her day's activities.
And so during those early years of my struggle in being diagnosed with bipolar disorder, it took me about a year to recover, being diagnosed in 2000 and 2001. It was a long time struggle. For me, recovery was actively working with a therapist for talk counseling and also with medication. So if you would like to know what medications help me, I'm happy to share that with you. You can just message me at erasingshame.com. But during that time, I also not only had depression, I also had suicidal ideation. So even though I had a loving family and I loved being with my son, my feelings of depression were just so overwhelming that I had moments where I didn't know how to live on. And suicide was something that crossed my mind as a way of stopping the pain of that struggle. Now, my suicidal ideation didn't get to the point of severity where I was planning a way to do that. And we didn't have lethal means of implementing that in the house. And then honestly, if I can be honest with you, Jeremiah, I was too afraid of the pain, the physical pain that would be involved in trying to die by suicide. Now, we'll fast forward. So that was back in 2000, 2001. We'll fast forward to 2017. And I'll briefly mention a personal crisis that I had in 2017, February 1st. And on that day, I had a hypomanic episode. So I have bipolar disorder 2, type 2, which means I have high mood swings and low mood swings. And on the high mood swings, I have extra energy, I feel like I need less sleep, and I have more creativity, and the ideas in my head are just constantly flowing. So it's a very good feeling, but it's also a very dangerous place to be if I just act out on those feelings without personal reflection and consideration. Well, on that day, I let myself go because I was frustrated with the difficulties I was facing in January. So I don't know how much of the details you remember, Jeremiah, but I'll review it with the people who are listening and watching. So in January, I had insomnia, laryngitis, and bronchitis. And out of that frustration, I said to myself, I'm going to let myself feel better and good the next time I have a high mood swing. Instead of doing the things that I've done for the past 17 years in learning to manage my mental health, I decided to unmanage it, not manage it when I had the next mood swing. Well, by the end of that day, I was apparently behaving strangely, and I was put in handcuffs and detained with a mandatory 72 hours hold in a psych ward in Anaheim, California. Now, the full story on that episode and my recovery is at my personal website, djchuang.com/my2017. And I'll add a link in the show notes at erasingshame.com for those of you that would like to hear that entire story. But Jeremiah was there midday and saw me before I was taken away in the police car. So I wanted to give you a moment, Jeremiah, to recall that episode. What do you remember?
Yeah, so that day in 2017, I was at school, and I was living in the dorms at that time, so I was not living with my parents, with you. And so I arranged to have a family dinner that night, and then I was able to invite some friends who were available as well. And we met at the Anaheim packing house.
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't notice anything wrong with you being in a hypomanic episode, as we have described it in hindsight. But I got the call from my mom afterwards that you had been detained that day. And that's because it was after we separated from dinner. We finished eating, and then I was heading back to my car. That's when you started behaving strangely.
Do you recall what I was doing? Because I don't.
Yes, my mom told me that you went to a fine dining restaurant within the Anaheim Packing House. It's called the Blind Rabbit. And you tried to get inside the restaurant without a reservation. So first you approached the hostess or the host and asked if you could get a table. You wanted to have a special date with my mom. And they found out you did not have a reservation, so they declined you, and then you tried to enter in. When they blocked you again, then you were resisting and not responding to their communication. And at some point, I think they called the police and had you get involved since you were being a difficult consumer.
Wow. Customer.
A consumer, indeed.
Yes. But being in the inside of a psych ward was very sobering. Never thought I would see the inside of one. Very humbling. And they put me on medication that felt like I was being sedated and stabilized. I think one of the things I'll mention here is in the medical model of psychology and psychiatry, their aim is to stabilize you. And because my body responded well to the medication, I was stabilized within the 3 days, and then they released me. Typically, people are not released until day 4, 5, even day 7. But when I was released, it also took me another 3 or 4 months to find the right mix of medication where I could feel somewhat normal again. And then it took 9 months to be more fully normal in terms of functioning well, being able to work again, and being able to maintain my self-care. Now, during that recovery process in April, okay, this is where Jeremiah's story picks up, because there was an episode in his life that was just as, or even more traumatic than my episode in February.
Yeah, so April 12th, 2017 was one of the worst days of my life, because I woke up to one of my friends from high school. His name was Parker, and he had been struggling with depression at school for many months. And the text I got from him that day was him saying that, "Oh, you're one of my best friends, and I've really appreciated being friends with you, and your work ethic is very admirable, and I've always been wished I could have that as well." And he was saying that after I'm gone, please make sure to spend time with my dad and play board games, just like we used to. We had a group of friends in high school where we would get together a lot to play board games. And so my friend was texting me this suicide note, his last words, and he was still thinking about his family, how his family could go on in the future and continue having good memories, even though he did not understand that dying by suicide leaves a huge hole in the hearts of those who continue living without the person that they lost. Mm-hmm. So so when I read this, I was in disbelief, because I didn't know that my friend's depression was this severe. I honestly didn't know that much about mental illness and how depression was related to suicidal ideation. And I figured depression was something that was treatable, something that you can overcome when you have the right support. But I had never thought about what happens if someone is having mental illness, having severe depression or severe anxiety or both. What happens if that does not receive help or support? Then unfortunately, some people can resort to suicide, and that is, with me being a survivor of suicide loss, I'm someone who has lost somebody from suicide. He was one of my best friends in high school, and that has been a very painful experience, and it has really changed the course of my life in terms of, this was a turning point in my life, because I'm experiencing this tragedy, the loss of a friend, 2 months after my dad has gone to the psych ward for his mental illness. And this has changed me because I now have much more compassion for those with mental illness and the tragedy in their stories. And this compassion also motivates me to find hope for them, to find support for them, to advocate for policies and research and community activities and beliefs that will bring people to have endurance and resilience in their own difficulties, to have resilience to continue loving those in need. And I'm glad the silver lining in all this is that I've been learning so much about emotional health and mental health and self-care and how to be a safe person to other people. And this has been a journey that has made my life much more human and much more human and enriched.
Thank you, Jeremiah, for being open and honest to share that really difficult time with all of us. I remember Parker well. He often came over to our house, and he was a fun-loving person. He was in marching band with you. He seemed to have a good social life. He had a lot of energy and aspiration for college life, and he was a good kid.
Mm-hmm.
So we treasure the good memories, and we learn things to help others to value life and to face the struggles of depression and suicidal ideation. That was just over 5 years ago, and so Jeremiah, you've been very active in helping with suicide prevention. So tell us about your involvement volunteering with the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention. What have you learned? What have you done as a volunteer? And what words of advice would you share in terms of suicide prevention and warning signs and helping those who may struggle or those who know someone who is struggling?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's a good question. So my journey with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention started with my involvement with Saddleback Church, actually. And the lead pastor there, Pastor Rick Warren and his wife Kay Warren, they had a son who struggled with mental illness his whole life. He had a dual diagnosis. And sadly, their story is marked with suicide loss. Their son died by suicide a few years around when we were going through our struggles. It was a couple years before or after 2017. And something that inspired me with the way they responded and recovered was that they were honest and vulnerable about their grief, and they would share their precious and cherished memories about their son, and they would share about how they were feeling about facing the future without him. And so I realized that if I join a community, a group of people that are willing to talk and to listen to difficult conversations about suicide and suicide loss, then that can be a wonderful source of recovery and of healing and of giving back to the community. And so that's how I started looking at what programs and volunteer opportunities the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention offers. They have a local chapter here in Orange County. And so I first started getting involved by seeing what sorts of events they volunteer at. So what they usually do is the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention focuses on three things. They focus on awareness of suicide, its preventions and causes, and they focus on advocacy. So in terms of policy making, talking to lawmakers, Congress people, how can we have our medical system be more effective in supporting those who have suicidal plans, and how do we prevent it long term as a society? And then they also focus on support and healing. So they have support groups and a few other resources that are crucial for helping those who have survived the loss of a suicide.
And so which part of that have you enjoyed volunteering the most?
What inspires me is the local things. I've learned that in Orange County, as there are annual events and festivals that happen on a regular basis, our local chapter here continues to reach out and to have a booth alongside all the other booths at the event. And what we've noticed is that when we first started out, when the chapter was founded a few years ago, talking about suicide and being present at these events to try and promote awareness of suicide, its statistics, and the tragedy and the danger of it. There was a lot of stigma where the crowds of people would avert their eyes and try to avoid our booth, and there would be this resistance to learning more about it, and resistance to finding out what resources are available. But in recent years, especially in the pandemic years, we've seen that people are very receptive, very affirming and positive to see that we're here, we're part of the community. We want to let people know that they can have support if they've survived a suicide loss. That we're actively working on preventing suicide and promoting mental health. And so seeing that change in people's attitudes and seeing the community rally together has been the primary source of inspiration for me as a volunteer.
Well, thank you, Jeremiah. And as we've endured the past 2.5 years of pandemic, the mental health crisis, on top of anti-Asian hate crimes, and then the instability with our financial situation, climate change, and things like that, and then suicide rate continues to climb. And so this is a very serious issue. And so when we talk about suicide, a person who may feel isolated and alone and in pain, when that person dies by suicide, it affects, on average, at least 113 people, according to the research. And I'll add a link in the show notes so you can look into that. And then out of those 113, at least 20 are impacted dramatically. And so even though if you're someone who's struggling with suicidal ideation, your life does matter and it does affect a lot of people. And then one of the fascinating researches about suicide is there's something to be learned from those who have attempted suicide but have survived, because they were in the frame of mind where they were trying to die, but they did not. And because they've survived, they've perhaps learned some things. They're able to share some things about what went through their mind so that we can add some preventive measure and add some support so that people that are in that state of mind and in that situation do not choose the route of death, but they would choose the route of life. And so we'll be having a future episode here on Erasing Shame with someone who survived their attempt at suicide and how they are able to not only survive but thrive in life. So that's in an upcoming episode that you'll want to stay tuned and watch. But as we talk about preventing suicide, what are some warning signs and things that we, as friends of someone or related to someone who may be struggling, what can we watch for and what can we do? Jeremiah, do you have a list you can share with us?
Sure thing. Yeah, so what I wanted to do now is to share with you what the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention's research has shown about what are the factors that affect the risk for suicide and what can be done for prevention. And so I'll be reading this list here, but also commenting some of the ways that I've experienced it. So as you might have heard before, mental illness is something that is affected by a holistic range of factors. It's affected by someone's psychology and emotional well-being or lack of well-being. It's affected by someone's environment. If they're in a positive or a negative environment, it's affected by someone's relationships as well, and also their spiritual beliefs. And so some of the risk factors with health could be having a formal mental illness. So you have bipolar disorder. That would be an example of something. Someone could also have schizophrenia or a conduct disorder or a personality disorder. But it does not, the risk for suicide is not limited to having a formal diagnosis. You could also be having a season of anxiety or depression, going through something that is emotionally very challenging, such as a breakup in a relationship or the loss of a family member. And so that can be a condition that affects someone's mental illness. Some other factors could be serious physical health conditions like chronic pain, or a traumatic brain injury. So please be aware of that. If someone's going through physical pain, you could also consider how that is affecting their mental state. And in terms of environment, it's important to know if someone has access to firearms or a lethal amount of drugs. So that's what you were mentioning before. We didn't have that in our house. We've never owned a gun, and we've never had a lethal amount of drugs available in the house. And some other environmental factors could be prolonged stress, such as unemployment or bullying or relationship problems. And there could also be exposure to suicide. That's an environmental risk factor for suicide. So if someone has died by suicide recently, then that could suggest to another struggling person that, suicide that's something within the range of options of dealing with difficulty. It's not okay, but that's how it gets introduced to people's minds sometimes. And this can especially happen in the media. If there's a TV show or a movie, or if a celebrity dies by suicide, then that's part of the environment and the risk factors. Now let's move on to, there's also some historical factors. So if someone's family has struggled with suicide for like an attempted suicide or a completed suicide, then that will affect how someone perceives it, how someone approaches if it's acceptable or even plausible, something to do. And it's also important to know if someone has had childhood abuse or trauma. That's a historical factor that could affect their suicidal ideation. So those are the risk factors that the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention has researched. But we don't want to end there. We want to talk about the protective factors. What kinds of things can you be watching out for and looking for in your own life if you're struggling? And so let's start with the mental, psychological area first. It goes without saying that professional mental health care is very helpful if you feel like you need it, or if you notice that someone else might need it. There are a range of options at different price points. You can find an affordable therapist, and you can get the help you need. And this is one way of expressing proactivity about mental health, right? When you take action to see a professional to talk about what you're experiencing, that is making a choice about your mental illness, making a choice to improve your mental health. And you can also do this in other ways. You can reach out for support and have a community and a family and friends who will listen to you and be safe people for you, people who will care for you. Maybe they'll make you a meal or give you a hug. It's their privilege, it's their honor to provide that for you, to learn what ways are enriching and fulfilling for you to be supported emotionally. And another protective factor is to have problem solving and coping skills. So when you approach a problem, how are you going to respond to it? If you can come up with a good plan, if you can think about, oh, okay, I need to find out how to do this in order to get the help I need, then having problem solving skills and healthy coping skills is a way to do that. And in terms of the environmental factors, it's important to limit access to firearms and other lethal means. We mentioned lethal drugs before. So when you limit access there, when you limit access in the environment to those means, then that is preventing suicide. And another area that I mentioned before was spiritual beliefs are related to suicide and mental illness. So if someone is part of a cultural or religion that encourages help seeking, that improves someone's sense of purpose and self-esteem, and discourages suicidal behavior, then that will go a long way towards preventing suicide.
Now, let me interject here, because it's been a tradition in some Christian circles that suicide is a sin and suicide is wrong, and people shouldn't be taking life into their own hands because only God is in charge of life. And some of that is true, but a lot of that is not helpful. So for someone who is struggling, what they need is not condemnation, because there is no condemnation for those of us who are in Christ Jesus. But what people need is compassion and care and support. So when you find someone, or if you yourself are someone who is struggling with suicidal ideation, recognize that God sees you valuable. You're created in the image of God, and while the emotions and the mental ideas and the oppressive thoughts are overwhelming, there is help and there is hope. Please reach out if you can. And if you're not able to reach out, those of you who recognize someone who may be behaving in a warning sign kind of way, reach out to them and provide the support and care and compassion that they are needing.
Mm-hmm.
All of us can do something.
Yeah.
You want to touch on some warning signs?
Yeah, so that's great for us to start discussing the warning signs. The key word when you're thinking about warning signs for suicidal ideation and behavior is a change in behavior. So it comes down to what do people say and what do they do. So if someone's struggling, you're going to see changes in one or both of these areas. So people who are struggling with suicide ideation will say things such as wanting to kill themselves, wanting to feel they can't find a way out, they feel trapped. They could talk about feeling hopeless or not having a future. And if they're being honest, they'll be talking about how much pain they're in. And be sure to listen when you notice someone going through that. Sometimes people with mental illness will say they feel like they're a burden to other people. And that's a very difficult feeling to go through. And something that I experience when I have depression sometimes. And let's also talk about behavior. What are the warning signs of how people behave when they have suicidal ideation, when they're reaching the extra difficult point in their struggles? So it can look like increased use of alcohol or drugs. It can look like searching online for how to form a plan for suicide. It can look like withdrawing from the activities that they normally enjoy. They could isolate from friends and family. They could also start saying goodbye to friends and family and acquaintances. And related to these goodbyes is they could start giving away their prized possessions. So that's a big warning sign if you see someone doing that. If they anticipate that they're not going to be around, then they might try to give away those possessions. And something that might be counterintuitive with behavior is someone could get more aggressive or more fatigued. This is related to the mood swings that are part of struggling with mental illness. So that could also be a behavioral risk factor, a warning sign for suicidal ideation. And related to other moods and emotions that are warning signs, there's depression, there's anxiety, and loss of interest. We've mentioned those. There's also things like irritability and feeling ashamed. And someone could also mention feeling relief or sudden improvement. And that might be because they have mental illness, they're not completely in touch with a realistic perspective of their situation.
Okay. Thank you, Jeremiah. We appreciate your time in sharing your life and some of your struggles and your honesty and how mental health affects all of us, either around us or in us or both. And we want to create a safe place through this podcast and through virtual social media and even meeting up in person. We live here in Orange County, California, but because of my freelance consulting work, sometimes I travel around the country. Would be happy to connect with you in person and learn together how to live life well and to support each one of us together as a community to encourage Christian Asian mental health. It really does take not just a village, but a community. It takes the body of Christ really being the safe place to show compassion and care for those of us who do struggle. And all of us do struggle from time to time, and some of us struggle all the time. And it takes those who struggle and those who know someone who struggle to take those bold faithful step towards health and the resources God gives us in Him, in His Word, in His Spirit, and in the brothers and sisters around us to live well and worthy of the calling God's given us. So these are hopeful words. I hope you are feeling encouraged that suicide is not the last word. God has conquered death in eternity and in the now, that we have to receive with open hands and open hearts for the help that He desires to give us. So thank you for watching and listening to this episode of Erasing Shame. Check the show notes at erasingshame.com. Subscribe and like and share on Facebook, on YouTube, wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, please rate and leave a review so that others can be a part of this community as we continue this conversation into the weeks and months ahead about encouraging Christian Asian mental health. We want to start with these conversations, and then we want these conversations to start communities of care and compassion in local churches and in homes, where we can really fill a huge gap in stopping stigma, erasing shame, providing support to complement the professional help that doctors and therapists can provide. And then in doing all of that, we provide that continuum of care. I think that will change the lives of many for this and future generations. So thank you. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.